Hello and welcome to a special episode of How to Paint. Today we're diving back into Trench Crusade, but we're diving a little deeper. We're going down into the depths and doing some Lovecraftian inspired Trench Crusade models. These are the disciples of Tet'o. I 3D printed the models and then glued them to a base temporarily before giving them a black prime, followed by a spray of white from roughly 45 degrees to represent a zenithal highlight. I'm starting off with a basic trooper. This is the Idolator, and I've started to just block in some of the metal with a Necro Gold. And then I'm following that up with a Mojave White for all of the areas of cloth. I'm looking to kind of represent the old turn of the century diving suits that sailors used to wear. And for those very heavy inspired lead boots that they're wearing, I'm using Cobalt metal. This is a bluish metallic paint. I'm doing all of the pouches right now in a kind of leather brown and just getting that belt blocked in as well, just looking to cover up all the base tones. I'm adding some variation to the pouches with an orange leather, and this just kind of helps to break up some of those similar tones. I'm also using the orange leather for the gloves. For the rifle, I've gone back to the cobalt metal for now, but I will be adding some weathering to this later. And then for the tank on his back, I'm using a decayed metal. This is just a coppery metallic color, followed by a Victorian brass for the two larger tanks which are above. I'm looking to kind of add some variation to the metallics like I did for the leather colors, and just to kind of help break up some of those shapes. Lastly, I'm using a Ratling Grime for the tubes that are coming off of the helmet. I'm going to be giving the whole miniature a wash. For this, I'm using a dark brown wash from AK with some odorless thinner. And this is because this is an enamel wash and it's going to really get into those recesses. So I'm using that thinner just to kind of push and pull that wash around. It will take a while to dry, so we'll come back to this model in a minute. But first, a word about where these miniatures came from. Disciple of Tet'o is a grimdark miniature project from Daka store. The project features both 3D printed STLs and physical resin miniatures. It's available through Kickstarter and includes modular kits, pre-assembled miniatures, and unique hero models. The Disciple of Tet'o includes two factions, the Tet'o Idolators, inspired by Trench Crusade's Heretic Legion, and the Coven of Crusade, inspired by Trench Crusade's Black Grail. These are some incredibly cool looking designs for the Trench Crusade roster, so if you wanted an alternative appearance for some of those classic factions, this is the way to go. And there's an early bird special on Kickstarter. I'll leave a link in the description below. The Herald has this great cloak on him, so I'm using Occultist cloak for this. This is a SpeedPaint, so I'm just letting it inherit all of that shading from the zenithal from underneath. And then of course, like the other model, I'm just covering the whole thing in that enamel wash. Next up is the Swarm Carrier. So for this guy, I'm going to be using a different approach. I'm going to be starting off with the tentacles in this black-green, and just taking care that I don't get any of that on the cloak itself. After I'm happy with that, I'm then going to do the cloak again in Occultist cloak. This is a great speed paint for just this nice kind of blue-black color. And for the skin, I'm going to be using Thunderhawk blue. I like the idea that this is kind of a bloated corpse from beneath. Finally, for the symbol that the Swarm Carrier is holding, I'm using that Necro Gold. And to shade, I'm going to be using Dark Streaking Grime. This is a greenish blue enamel wash. I decided to paint up one of the bigger guys. This is a Keeper, and they are significantly bigger than the troopers and very menacing looking. The only difference with these guys is I'm using a black contrast paint. This is Black Templar on all of the kind of exposed like ribbing and undersuit. I'm doing the armor in exactly the same way as I did for the Idolator and the Herald. So I'm just making sure I take my time picking those sections, those plate mail sections that I want to highlight. For the tentacles that are bursting out from underneath the helmet, I'm doing them the same way I did the Swarm Carrier. And the skin in that Thunderhawk blue as well. For this gigantic rifle that he's holding, I'm using a Ratling Grime as the base color. And then once that's dry, I'm covering the whole thing again in that dark brown enamel wash, and then massaging it around the model with those mineral spirits. Now that it's had some time to dry, I'm going back to that original Idolator soldier and I'm starting to add some highlights. And for this, I'm using Elven Gold, and I'm just choosing some of the bigger, flatter areas to add these patches of this bright gold color. Afterwards, I'm giving the metallics a light dry brush of plate mail metal. This does a really good job of adding just a little bit of scratches and damage to it. And then I watered down some of that orange leather, and I'm using that as a rust, just by letting that paint kind of well up and create almost like a coffee stain. I'm also doing the same effect on the chains on the Herald. Afterwards, it's time to add some patina, and for this I love using Nihilakh Oxide. This is just a very, very thin teal paint that sits really nicely in the recesses, and then you can also use a damp brush to push away and get that patina into the areas that you want it. I've decided to go back into the cloth areas and add some highlights. This is that original Mojave White, followed by just a couple strokes of the bold titanium white to imply like kind of highlights and wrinkles. I've decided to add some weathering to the cloth, so for that I'm using Athonian Camo Shade, and I'm almost kind of dabbing this on, splotching it on into some of the recessed areas around the legs, around the arms, and then I'm using a damp brush again to feather the edge if I want to, or leave it as like a kind of coffee stain. For the Herald's cape, I'm actually going to be highlighting this with a makeup sponge. This does a really good job of just creating a soft highlight. I started off with some Sons of Horus green, and then added in some grey blue and built up my highlights in a kind of gradient. You could also use a very, very soft makeup brush or a dry brush for this. And then once I'm happy with those highlights, I then use the pure grey blue and the edge of my brush just to work my way around the tattered edge of the cape. I love the greenish glow on the artwork, so I'm going to be recreating that. To start that off, I'm prepping the eyes in white, and then for the recessed sections, I'm actually using a white ink. You could also use a watered down white for this. And then I'm using good old Tesseract Glow here. You could use a neon green if you wanted, and this goes over the top of that white perfectly and creates a really, really neon fluorescent color. I'm using Baneblade Brown here. This is just to add some scratches and damage to the leather. And then I'm repeating the same process that I did on the Herald's cape on the Keeper's loincloth here. I decided to go for a medium sand, and I'm using the edge of the brush to highlight some of the ridges on the gun. This is giving me kind of Breath of the Wild vibes, so I'm going for that color palette. For some of the orbs on the gun, I'm going to be using Baharroth Blue. You could also use that Nihilakh Oxide as well from earlier. And then to highlight the tentacles, I'm starting off with a Gunship Green, and then slowly introducing some of that Mojave White. I'm building that up in stages and layers, getting smaller and smaller as I go. For the skin tones, I'm starting off with the Thunderhawk Blue, and then I'm mixing in some of that neon blue from the orbs. And this creates a very saturated gradient that we can build up in. And then my final highlight is the pure Baharroth Blue. Finally, I'm giving the hair a quick dry brush with some white. I want to start working on the bases, and what I should have done is maybe use a different type of glue. I use super glue on these, so I've got to very, very carefully pry them off. But for the bases themselves, I'm going to be prepping them with some golden earth. This is a texture paint from ProAcryl, and I'm just kind of scooping this on with a small spatula. And then as that's drying, I'm going to be pushing in some cork rocks and some debris that I have lying around. And I'm even using some 3D printed coral and shells as well. While those are drying, I'm going to return back to the swarm carrier, and we're going to be using that same stippling technique with the makeup brush, this time building up with a rainy grey, and then slowly introducing that Mojave white again, that ivory color. Once that's done, I'm then going to highlight the tentacles exactly how I did on the Keeper. This is kind of a slow process. There's a lot of tentacles to do here, but it's really fun, and you can just spend your time just getting lost in the sculpt itself. I try to stick to just the upturned surfaces where light would naturally catch that tentacle, and also roughly where the front of the miniature is. Once I've got those highlights in place, it's then time to just finish up the stitching. This is just Ratling Grime on here. And then I'm going to highlight the skin, again how I did the Keeper's skin, with that Baharroth blue, until I mix up to basically a kind of ivory color. It wouldn't be Lovecraftian Trench Crusade without even more tentacles, so I've decided to paint the Abyss Beast. This is a huge miniature, and it's very Cthulhu inspired. And I'm also at the same time doing a Crusade Scout because I love the design of this guy. Starting off with a Prismatic Bolt airbrush, and then followed with a Absolution green speed paint on the lower section. You could do this with a damp brush and create that gradient yourself. I find that the airbrush is just a little bit quicker on this. Finally, I'm using Gauss Blaster Green as the highlight. Again, you could use that Nihilak Oxide from before. And I'm just getting a highlight from above on the beast, and on the scout, I'm getting the tentacles. Once that's dry, I decided to go back in with that Absolution Green and just kind of create this hard edge between the dark and the bright of the tentacles. I'm using a damp brush here to feather that gradient. And then I'm using Irocco to prep the spikes on the beast, building up to that ivory Mojave white again. I'm mixing the two colors together, and then I finally do a final highlight in that ivory. For the eyes, right now I'm just going to hit them with some Absolution green just to see how they look. And then, because this is a thin speed paint, it's great for getting in those little gaps around the eyelids. And then I think I've got a plan. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a grayscale from white to grey on the outside here, and then cover the whole thing in that Tesseract glow. Once I'm happy with that, I'm then going to go in and add a black pupil in the middle, followed by a couple of white dots for some painted in highlights. Finally, I'm going to go in with one of those neon blues that I have on my palette, and I'm just going to edge highlight around the model. For the scout, I'm just going to go a little bit further and do some pink here, and I'm adding kind of a band of pink around the very, very top of those tentacles, and then I'm dampening the brush and just feathering that edge. I'm also doing this for around the top of the head where the shell meets the kind of squid body. For the shell itself, I'm using that Mojave White Ivory color again. And the nice thing about sharing all these colors is they all start to look like a uniform army. And to give it that really nasty sea look, I'm going to be using some of that Athonian camo shade and shading that whole shell section. I'm doing a final dab here of that Mojave White just to kind of add a subtle gradient to the shell. And I'm following that with an edge highlight of white. For the big armor section on the top of the head, I'm using some of that decayed metal, copper, metallic paint from earlier. And then I'm just hitting these small barnacles with some of that brown, Baneblade brown. Going back to that armor section, I'm weathering it exactly how I did on the other models, so I'm starting off with a dry brush of silver, followed by that Nihilakh Oxide patina. For the eyes, originally I was going to do them the same as the Abyss Beast, but then after I put the Absolution green on there, I was really happy with the dark, glossy, kind of scary looking eyes, so I just decided to add a couple white highlights to this. I then added a small, subtle Tesseract Glow edge highlight here. Returning to the bases, I've now primed them separately so they're ready to paint. Starting off with a dark grey blue, I'm airbrushing this around the outside. Again, you could dry brush this if you're very careful. Followed by some of that medium sand color right in the middle there. The idea behind this is I want the appearance of a deep sea kind of visibility. For all of the extra pieces on the base, I'm just hitting these with some speed paint. I've got some neon speed paints here, some bright color speed paints, and I'm just adding these to the shells and to the sections on the base. If I wanted these colors to be brighter, I would have hit them with a white first, but I kind of like just blending it in with that dark blue and having that show from underneath. It kind of adds its own natural shading. I'm finishing out the bases by gluing on some of these neon tufts. And then finally, a black rim around the outside of the base. And here are my Deep Sea Trench Crusade models. These are really, really cool. A big thank you to Daka Daka Store for the collaboration and the chance to paint these early. As soon as I saw a combination of Lovecraftian horror and Trench Crusade, I was in love. Be sure to check out the Kickstarter campaign down in the description below. Drop a like on the video if you've really enjoyed this content, and comment down below as well if you want to see me paint more of these models. A big thank you to my YouTube members, and if you're interested in my Patreon, be sure to check out the link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.